to be showing you how to dry hop. It's one of the methods in which brewers introduce that big aroma into their beers. So if you watch the brew day video that I went through, you will have seen that adding hops late on in the boil, and then also you can add hops in what we call the whirlpool stage, is how brewers get that big aroma and big flavor into their beers. And the third way that they do it is by dry hopping. So dry hopping basically means that you are adding hops after or during fermentation. So you'll tend to be using the low alpha acid hops, because these are the ones that when you smell them, they have that big fruity aroma, that big smell. So if you're designing recipes and you want to get that kind of aroma, that thing that smacks you in the face when you open those IPAs, then you're looking at your low alpha acid hops. There are a few schools of thought on the timing of your dry hopping. So this is based around how far along the fermentation is. Some people like to add their hops after fermentation, primary fermentation has completed. Others like to add it whilst that primary fermentation is still ongoing. So if you look at modern day breweries, especially the ones that are producing those massive aroma pale ales and the IPAs, they are adding hops on a basis like using techniques that do not allow any oxygen into the wort. So recent scientific studies have found that oxygen introduced into beer has a negative impact on the hop aroma and flavor. So for home brewers, it's the reason why when you make an IPA or a pale ale, you find that after maybe 6 weeks, much of the flavor has gone out of your beers, and you're left with just something that has a hint of that tropical flavor and aroma, and it's more bitter. That's why it's best to drink your beers early. But you can try and extend the life of your beers by keeping that oxygen to the lowest, and that is why some home brewers like to add their hops during that primary fermentation phase. This is because the yeast is still producing that carbon dioxide. So when you are opening up the top of the bucket, you are risking oxygen coming in, as well as the oxygen that is surrounding those hops. So when you are adding them into the wort, if the yeast is still producing CO2, it's going to reduce the amount of oxygen that you are introducing into the wort. So I recommend, and what I do is I add my hops during that primary fermentation phase. So you can take your hydrometer measurements, sometimes daily, so you can follow the gravity readings and you can see how close it's getting to your final gravity that you are aiming for, and you can try and time it. It's usually around 3 to 4 days into fermentation, where the yeast is still going but it's starting to slow down. Then you can add your dry hops. There are some studies which show that there is a negative impact with the yeast and the hops. So it's trying to find that right balance of still getting the benefits of the reduced oxygen but not adding the hops too early. So the whole notion of the timing and the oxygen, I will post a really great article. It explains everything in detail. I'll post it in a link below. So I talked about the timing in terms of when you're introducing the hops for the dry hopping phase. The next thing you need to think about in terms of the timing is how long you leave those hops in for. So again, people do different things. Some people leave their hops in for 10 days, make sure they get all of that extraction. Most breweries, they have techniques in which they can do it in a couple of days. Some of them, if they have a mechanism where they pass the wort through a chamber holding the wort, they can do it in maybe a few hours. They found that they can get the full extraction that way. But at home, I think a good timing for how long you're dry hopping for is about 3 to 5 days. So I tend to add my dry hops. I wait, usually this time I'm going to wait 5 days because I want to make sure I'm getting all the extraction out, because for my recipe it's about that massive aroma. So I'm going to leave mine for 5 days, but between 3 to 5 days is a good timing, I think. And then also, as you're adding your hops whilst you're coming towards the end of primary fermentation, you're also going to be raising that temperature because you're giving the yeast the different temperature in order to start cleaning out the wort. And yeast like to clean up after their mess, and this is done at slightly higher temperatures. So if you're starting your primary fermentation at around 18 degrees, as you're coming towards the end of your fermentation, most home brewers and most breweries like to raise that temperature up to say 21 degrees Celsius. So again, this is actually beneficial in terms of dry hopping. So with the introduction of these new, say, India pale lagers that are coming on the market, actually the lagering process is taking place at a lower temperature, but they have found that they need to raise the temperature to say 14 degrees in order to get enough extraction from the hops. So again, this slightly raising of their temperature I think is beneficial in terms of getting that those hop oils out into the wort. So another thing you're going to be thinking about is how much hops, how many grams are you going to be using during this dry hop phase. For my recipe, I'm using quite a lot. I think I'm up in 150 grams for the 21 litres of beer that I am producing. Some people use far less, some people use even more than that. I think that a famous beer such as Pliny the Elder, if you're brewing a clone of that, that's up in the 150 grams per 19 litres of beer wort. So you need to experiment in terms of the types of hops that you're using and how much of those you need to use to get the kind of aroma and flavour that you're looking for. But if you're just starting out, then you're going to be following a recipe. So it's going to tell you the grams of hops that you're going to need. Also, another thing that is a technique that people use is that they layer the dry hopping. So say perhaps you are looking to introduce it during primary fermentation, then you would add say 50 grams of dry hops, and then a couple of days later you will introduce another 50 grams, and then maybe a couple of days later you introduce another 50 grams. So 150 in total, but you are getting different stages of that fermentation process. So the yeast is interacting with the hops in a different way at each stage as the yeast is going through its process of creating alcohol and then finally dropping off to the bottom. So that is a technique that some people use. I personally just throw all of my hops in at one time, and I find that that's enough. I don't find that I need to layer mine, but I think if you research more and maybe test out, homebrewing is all about just trying different techniques and see what happens. And maybe you have one bucket where you just throw them all in at the same time, and another bucket where you layer it, and then you can taste after it's been bottled and see if there's any difference and see how long it lasts, etc. But for me today, I'm just going to be throwing all of my hops in all at once. Previously, most home brewers used to use a technique called racking. This is when they move the wort from the primary fermentation bucket to a second container, usually with a lot less headspace, where they can introduce the hops. The idea of this was to get the beer off of the yeast cake and get it into a new container where they can add the hops and the yeast isn't affecting the process. But as I've talked about, you do not need to do this. Now the new understanding is that you can dry hop during the primary fermentation phase, and it's actually beneficial because of the reduced oxygen intake. If you are racking onto another container, then you are risking the wort being introduced with oxygen. You can reduce this by, say, pumping CO2 into that container, as well as putting the hose to the bottom and making it fill up very slowly so there's no splash, no bubbling. So if you are going to rack and move the beer into a second container, then try and use those techniques. But I personally do not rack into a second container. I keep it in primary fermentation, the same chamber. I do not see any need to rack. There was a school of thought in which if you leave the beer on the yeast cake for too long, then it adversely affects the beer. I think that this is more of a problem for breweries, especially say if you are lagering, etc. But breweries where they have a large volume of beer over a very big yeast cake, and that's why they have those conical shaped fermentation vessels, because that reduces the amount of yeast that is coming into contact with the beer, and it concentrates it down on the bottom. But as a home brewer, I don't think you're going to be holding that beer, that wort, on that yeast cake for long enough for it to really adversely affect it. So I don't tend to worry about this. So I dry hop in my fermentation bucket. I do not rack, and I think you should do the same. But yeah, that's the general idea of dry hopping. So it's about adding big flavor and aroma, and the most important thing to think about is reducing that oxygen that you're introducing into the wort, so that your beers last longer and the flavor is more fuller and there's bigger aroma. And then also, of course, as with everything with brew day, sanitation is absolutely key. So you're adding something from the outside world into the wort, so you need to make sure that everything that is touching those hops and the hops themselves, you try and reduce any kind of exposure to possible bad agents, bacteria, etc. So again, always clean everything, clean all of your utensils, make sure your hands are clean, everything that's coming into contact with the wort, everything should be clean. So let's get on with the dry hopping day.
Alright, so here's the hop bag. It is soaking in some star sand solution, just making sure that it's nice and clean. As you can see, it's floating. It will do the same with the hops in the beer. So I got myself some whiskey stones. I'm going to chuck these in as well. I'll put them inside the bag when I put them into the beer for the dry hopping. It will make the bag sink to the bottom, and that will mean that all of the hop pellets are in contact with the beer. So get them in there. I'm going to leave this for about 10 minutes, let it soak up, and I'll show you what I'm doing with the hops. I am weighing out my hops according to my recipe. I need 171 grams of these hops for the dry hopping phase. Your recipe will differ. You know, this is quite a lot of hops. I'm trying to get big aroma in my beer, so I'm using a lot of hops in this dry hopping phase. Your one may be much less depending on the recipe that you're using, but I'm making 21 liters. I'm using 171 grams. Hopefully that's going to transfer into a big aroma pale ale. Notice that the dish is very clean. I have sterilized it. I've made sure that there is no dirt, no grime on it. It's a completely clean dish. It's very important because you don't want any bacteria getting into the beer now, because fermentation is almost over, so there's very little yeast that is going to be eating up any bacteria that you introduce. So extremely important that you sterilize everything that's going to be in contact with the beer. Make sure nothing falls on these hops, etc. The hop bag is currently in the star sand solution, so I'm going to bring that out, rinse it out. Whilst I'm handling the hop bag, I'm going to make sure that I have sterilized my hands so they are clean. Some people wear gloves. I feel that I don't need to, as long as I have washed my hands and I've dipped them in that star sand solution. I haven't had any problems so far in my brewing, so I'll rinse out that hop bag and I'll add these hops, and then we'll move to the fermentation bucket and I'll show you how I throw them in there. As I explained earlier, we are trying to keep the amount of oxygen that gets introduced into the beer to the absolute minimum. Depending on the stage of your fermentation,
this might involve you having to purge the hops with some CO2 if you have a CO2 canister. There's also another technique where you boil water so that you remove the oxygen from the water, and then you drop the hops in there, and then you add all of that into the beer worts. I have a bit more primary fermentation to go, so I think that when I add the hops it will be fine. The yeast will still be eating up the oxygen and producing CO2, so I think that I can just drop the hops in as long as I keep the lid open for as short time as possible. I'll throw those hops in, and hopefully primary fermentation will continue for another couple of days, and it won't affect the oxidation of the beer. Alright, so this hop bag is sterilized enough. I'm just going to wash my hands first in the sterilizing solution. I've taken off rings and bracelets, etc. So just because I don't want to get so much sterilizing solution in the beer right now, I'm gonna just rinse this a little bit, try and get as much out. My hands are clean, so this should be fine. I don't normally get any problems with my beers, so that should be enough. I have here the whiskey stones that I'm using to weigh the hop bag down, so I'll just throw those in there. Now I have the hops that I've already weighed out. Add these to the bag. Get any ones that are stuck. Now, because my bag is so big, I am able to just tie a knot in it. Just want to leave a bit of slack here because those hops will expand once they're soaking up the beer. And then I can just leave it resting in this sterilized bowl until I'm ready to throw them into the fermentation bucket. I have raised the temperature inside the fermentation bucket up to around 21 degrees Celsius. I started fermentation at 18 degrees, and that was at the beginning of primary. As primary comes to a close, I like to raise the temperature, let the yeast do its thing at that higher temperature range. I also think that it helps the absorption of the hop oils when I am dry hopping, so I raise the temperature with a couple of days left in primary fermentation, so I will be able to dry hop at this temperature now. You can see on the side of the bucket that there's that yeast cake. You can see that it is doing its magic inside there. The fan is on. I need to change that temperature on the thermostat, but everything seems to be working well. There's no yeast inside of the airlock, so everything is great. So now it's time to add those hops and get that big aroma. As I explained earlier in the video, the CO2 that is built up in this top half of the fermentation bucket is like a layer protecting it from oxygen. CO2 is slightly heavier than the air outside, so you have that small window to throw the hops in. So I'm going to open up the bucket very quickly and chuck these hops in and shut it again, just to make sure that as little oxygen as possible gets in there. So first of all, I'll wash my hands again. Because this is the hand that's going to be touching the hop bag. So I will open the bucket up very quickly and throw it in. You can see the yeast doing its thing in there. And that's it. That will slowly sink to the bottom. Alright, so we've thrown those hops in that fermentation bucket. I'm going to leave mine in there for around 5 days. Your recipe will tell you how many days that you should be dry hopping for. For my personal recipes, which I designed myself, I think around 5 days is a good amount of time. Some people leave theirs for a lot longer, some say 10 days, etc. Just note that the longer that you leave those hops in the bucket, the more at risk you are of getting those like grassy flavors into your final beer product. So around 5 days I reckon is optimum. So this concludes the dry hopping day. In my next video I'm going to be showing you the next step in producing your beer, which is the bottling day. Most home brewers, when they start, they're not getting into kegging straight away, so it's usually bottling. So check out my next video, it'll explain the whole bottle day process.